Good evening and welcome to our second webinar on Williams syndrome, which focuses on the new Special Educational Needs Framework, Implications for Children with Williams syndrome. We are very pleased that so many of you are able to join us from again all over the world. I hope that you can all hear us. We are not able to present the slides and ourselves at the same time, but hopefully the fact that you can only hear us and not see us won't be a problem. Before we start, let us introduce ourselves. I'm Dr. Jo van Heurigen, and I'm an Associate Professor in Developmental Psychology at Kingston University, London. I'm also the Educational Needs Advisor for the Williams Syndrome Foundation. My research focuses on language and number development in typical and atypically developing populations, and I've worked with individuals with Williams syndrome for over 15 years, and I've seen over 200 people with Williams syndrome.
Hello, I'm Olympia Palikara. I'm Senior Lecturer in Educational Psychology at the University of Roehampton. My research focuses mainly on the educational and psychosocial outcomes of children with special educational needs, and I'm particularly interested on how the needs of children are met in schools under the new Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice. I'm going to start by providing an outline about what we are going to cover today. So we accept that in our webinar today we will provide an overview of the key changes introduced by the new Special Educational Needs Framework that was introduced in England 3 years ago in 2014 and has major implications on how the needs of children are being met. Following an introduction to the key changes introduced by the new SEND system, we will then focus on the introduction of the Education, Health and Care Plans, which are the legal documents that replaced statements of special educational needs. More specifically, we are going to provide an overview of who can initiate an Education, Health and Care Plan, how long does this process take, what does it involve. Additionally, we are going to consider what are the different sections of the Education, Health and Care Plans that should be covered. Then we will focus on the implications that the new Special Educational Needs system has for supporting children with Williams syndrome in school. Based on our knowledge of their cognitive and behavioral profile, we will consider the implications that the specific profile of strengths and needs has in supporting these children in schools. Finally, we will be able to address your questions. You can write your questions during the presentation and we will pick out and answer as many as we can at the end. When writing your questions, please state who you are.
The Children and Families Act 2014 introduced a series of changes in the process of assessment and identification of children in need of special support in England and Wales. This was the first substantial change in special educational needs and disability policy in over a decade, and as such brought along a new series of implications for professional practice and service provision for vulnerable children and young people. A new Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice was introduced to provide statutory guidance on duties, policies and procedures relating to the legislation extending the age provision from birth to 25 years of age. The new SEND Code of Practice actually introduced a number of key changes. We are going to go through now some of these key changes. The first one concerned the emphasis of the new SEND Code of Practice on a person-centered approach to provision, with a strong emphasis on participation of children, their families and young people in decision-making. By adopting this approach, the voices of children and their families, as well as young people, acquire a strong position and must be considered when planning their assessment and intervention. Additionally, the new SEND framework highlighted the importance of multi-agency work between local authorities, health and care. Another important change introduced by the new SEND framework concerned the extension of the statutory protection from 16 to 25, the introduction of the personal budget, the introduction of the Education, Health and Care Plans, And we would like to highlight that all these duties apply to all state-funded schools. It's important to also mention that the new SEN framework gives stronger emphasis on high aspirations and improving the outcomes for all children with special educational needs. It also provides guidance on publishing a local offer for support for children with special educational needs. We are going to explain more in relation to what is local offer later on during this webinar. And it also provides guidance on graduated approach to identifying and supporting pupils and children with special educational needs. It's important to point out here that actually this graduated approach replaced what it used to be the school action and school action plus in the previous SEN code of practice. Okay, now what is the local offer? In a sense, the local authorities must publish a local offer setting out in one place information about provision they expect to be available across education, health and social care for children and young people in their area of special educational needs, including those that they do not have an education, health and care plan. It's important to note here that the local offer has two key purposes. The first one is to provide actually clear and accessible and up-to-date information about the available provision and also information about how this provision can be accessed. The second purpose of the local offer is to make provision more responsive to the local needs and inspirations by directly involving children and young people with SEND, their parents and service providers in the development of the local offer and also in the review of this. It should be noted that local offer includes provision within the local authority area and also outside the local area. If you would like to find more information about what should be included in the local offer, you can find the relevant information on section 4.30 of the Code of Practice. One question that very often is asked concerning the Education, Health and Care Plan assessment concerns who can request it. As you can see in this slide, there are a number of people that can actually request an Education, Health and Care Plan assessment. These are the parents or their carers that they can ask the local authority to carry out an assessment. Actually, the young persons themselves can request this if they are aged between 16 or 25, or actually anybody else who thinks an assessment is necessary. Just to give some examples, this can be doctors, health visitors, or teachers. In this complex figure, which is actually taken by the Code of Practice, you can see an overview of the statutory timescales for an Education, Health and Care Needs assessment and the development of the Education, Health and Care Plan. As you can see here, the process starts with a request for an assessment that it's brought to the local authority's attention. Now, if the local authority decides that they want to proceed with the assessment, then they need to notify the parents of, or the young person about their decision to proceed with the Education, Health and Care assessment within a maximum of 6 weeks from the request of the assessment. Then what follows is that the local authority needs to gather the information in relation to Education, Health and Care Plan assessment. If the local authority decides that an Education, Health and Care Plan is needed, then the LA has the responsibility to draft the plan and send it to the parents or the young person. The parents or the young person, they have 15 calendar days to comment on the actual plan or to express their preference for an education institution that they would like the child to attend. As you can see here, the local authority has to consult with the government body, the principal of the educational institution before naming them on the education, health and care plan. And it's important to highlight here that this institution has to respond within 15 calendar days. Following a consultation with the parents or the young person, the draft plan is amended where is needed, and then it's being issued. What happens if the local authority decides that they are not going to proceed with an education, health and care needs assessment? Then in this case, the local authority needs to notify the parents or the young person of their decision. And it should be noted here that the parents or the young person have the right to appeal within a period that takes no more than 6 weeks. Now, what is the timeline in relation to the completion of an education, health and care plan? According to the Code of Practice, this should take no more than 20 weeks from the time of the initial request. However, we should note here that the current reality is that there are still long delays in the completion of the process. If you want to find more information in relation to this, please consult the sections 9.39 up to 9.44 of the actual Code of Practice. Okay. Now another figure taken again from the Code of Practice. This actually includes the different sections that an education, health and care plan should have. As you can see here, there are a number of sections that should be included in the plan. Section A, this includes the views, interests and aspirations of the child and actually of his parents. Section B concerns the description of the child's or the young person's special educational needs. Section 3 describes the health needs of the child, those that they are related to the child's special educational needs. Section D provides a description of the social care needs of the child that again are related to the special educational needs or the disability of the child. Section E describes the outcomes that the child or the young person should have. Section F actually is the ones that describes the special educational needs provision that it's required in order to meet the needs of the child. Section G refers to the health provision that it's required and results actually for the special educational needs of the child. Section H refers to any social care provision that it may be required. Section I provides the name and the type of institution that needs to be attended. Section J provides the details of a personal budget if there is one. This includes also details of this and if a direct payment could be made. And finally, Section K provides the advice and information gathered during the education, health and care needs assessment.
Why Section E on outcomes is of particular importance for children with special educational needs? in the previous code of practice, there was an emphasis on processes. However, we know from research evidence that the outcomes for children with special educational needs have been described as rather poor. So in the new code of practice, there is actually an emphasis on strengths rather than difficulties. And outcomes should be closely related to the children's views, interests, and aspirations. And also what is important to remember is that outcomes are seen in the new SEND framework in relation to the preparation for adulthood. What should Section E cover in relation to the outcomes? So it should, education, health and care plans must specify the outcomes sought for the child or young person in Section E. Education, health and care plans should be focused on education and training, health and care outcomes that will enable children and young people to progress in their learning and as they get older to be well prepared for adulthood. Education, health and care plans can also include wider outcomes such as positive social relationships and emotional resilience and stability. It should be noted that outcomes should always enable children and young people to move towards the long-term aspirations of employment or higher education, independent living and community participation. If you want more details about this, you can find them in Chapter 8 of the Code of Practice. Long-term aspirations are not outcomes in themselves. Aspirations must be specified in Section A of the Education, Health and Care Plans. This is something that very often gets mixed in the Education, Health and Care Plans that we have reviewed for the purposes of our research. A local authority cannot be held accountable for the aspirations of a child or young person. For example, a local authority cannot be required to continue to maintain an education, health and care plan until a young person secures employment. However, what the education, health and care plan should continue to do is to maintain whether the young person wants to remain in education and provides clear evidence that shows that special educational provision is needed to enable them to achieve the education and training outcomes required for a course or program that moves them closer to employment. For example, by accessing a supported internship or apprenticeship, the young people have the opportunity to do that. An outcome can be defined as the benefit or difference made to an individual as a result of an intervention. It should be personal and not expressed from a service perspective. It should be something that those involved have control and influence over, and while it does not always have to be formal or accredited, it should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. The outcome, Section E concerning outcomes should be personalized, specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic. This is known as SMART outcomes. When an outcome is focused on education or training, it will describe what the expected benefit will be to the individual as a result of the educational or training intervention provided. Outcomes are not a description of the service being provided. For example, the provision of 3 hours of speech and language therapy is not an outcome. In this case, the outcome is what it is intended for the speech and language therapy will help the individual to do that they cannot do now and by when this will be achieved. It is important to know that when agreeing outcomes, we need to consider both what it is important to the child or the young person, so what they themselves want to be able to achieve, and what it is important for them as judged by others with the child or young person's best interests at heart. From year 9 onwards, the nature of the outcomes will reflect the need to ensure young persons are preparing for adulthood. Just to say that, particularly in relation to preparation for adulthood, On the outcome session, there needs to be a focus on higher education or employment, on how the young people will manage to live as independently as possible, and also for their participation in the society. So, given the variability that exists between different local authorities in the processes that they are following concerning the production of education, health and care plans, it's sometimes very difficult for the parents to navigate through what actually makes a quality education, health and care plan. So we are just trying here to provide some advice on what are the important aspects to consider when you are reviewing your child's education, health and care plan. The first is that this plan should be co-produced from all the important people involved in your child's life. The second concerns that there should be a focus on the child's outcomes. And it's important to remember here that these outcomes should be measurable and they should be timely. A quality education, health and care plan should also provide a positive description of the strengths of the child, so what the child can do. However, it should also provide a detailed description of the children's needs. It is also very important for the education, health and care plan to be a document that is concise, clear, understandable and also accessible by all those interested in it. Now, my colleague Jovan Herregen is going to say a little bit more about the particular needs of children with Williams syndrome in relation to the education, health and care plans.
Okay, thank you, Olympia. So Olympia's already provided an overview of the EHCP process. Many of you will know that children with Williams syndrome display a number of difficulties, including health issues, learning needs, anxiety issues, social needs and physical needs. What I'm going to do very briefly is discuss each of those and how they then apply to the EHCP. In our previous webinar, we already discussed a lot of these in a lot more detail. So this time I'm not going to go into all the details, but you can always request from us the previous webinar recording. So here's just a reminder of some of the main learning difficulties that children with Williams syndrome may have. I just want to stress that when I go through these, not all children with Williams syndrome may show all of these difficulties, but in my experience, many children with Williams syndrome will have difficulties with education, health and care. So what are the educational needs of children with Williams syndrome? So many children with Williams syndrome have delayed language development, starting very early onwards with delayed first words coming out, but mainly also with grammatical understanding. And language in Williams syndrome can be very deceptive, so their understanding is generally much poorer than their comprehension. So this obviously will affect their education and their educational progress. Another factor that might need to be considered is their motor difficulties and how they impact on the educational needs of a child. So for example, children with Williams syndrome might have difficulties with writing with a pen and fine motor abilities that affect their independence. Getting changed for PE, for example, is a big one. Overall, children with Williams syndrome will have very good short-term memory, so they're very good at remembering things that they've heard, but they might not be very good with working memory, which is the ability to manipulate information in mind, for example, when adding up two numbers, or to remember the letter they're trying to write down whilst concentrating very hard writing the actual letter. We also know that children with Williams syndrome have issues with attention. Some of those issues might be driven by sensory issues. So generally, children with Williams syndrome have difficulties planning their attention, so moving their eyes, for example, from the whiteboard to the paper in front of them or the activity that they're doing, but also to sustain their attention on a particular task. They often get distracted, especially by social sensory issues. So for example, they love looking at other people's faces, they love interacting with other people, or they might be distracted by certain sounds that they might hear or by certain textures. Finally, we know from our research that children with Williams syndrome often have an information processing bias in that they like details or focus more on the details rather than the complete picture, if you may want to call it. And obviously that makes it much harder for them to start combining facts into a theory or a general understanding. Having said that, these are the difficulties that children with Williams syndrome might have and affect their educational learning. However, they're very good at verbal memory and have very good facial recognition. And obviously these factors, these strengths need to be taken into account when thinking how some of these difficulties in Williams syndrome may be overcome when writing the outcomes. As Olympia has mentioned, it's very important for each of these sections, especially for section B, C and D, to get evidence of the needs that children may have. And the evidence that might be used as part of the HCP process would be teacher reports, SENCO reports, but also assessments by educational psychologists. Even the Williams Syndrome Foundation has some very good guidelines for teachers and parents, and these guidelines could be submitted as evidence of what children with Williams syndrome in general require, but also reports from speech and language therapists about the language delay and how that may impact on children's learning, as well as reports from occupational therapists to show how the motor and independence differences impact on their learning. Right, I'm going to move on quickly on towards the health issues of children with Williams syndrome. And as I mentioned, every child with Williams syndrome is different. However, many children with Williams syndrome will have cardiovascular issues. And obviously these may impact on children's school and also children's life when having to walk very far, having to take part in PE, and just taking part in life in general. This also relates to the fact that many children with Williams syndrome have mobility issues, which impacts again on their independence, but also their self-care. Another aspect that is often overlooked in of the EHCPs that we've seen so far is the fact that many children with Williams syndrome have special diets. Some of them even have feeding tubes. And obviously this is going to impact on their daily life in school, especially during lunchtime. Very often we see in the EHCPs that provision is provided for children during the school time, but not necessarily during lunchtime. Seeing these health issues, this is obviously very important. Another aspect of their health is that some children with Williams syndrome may have hearing difficulties. They're very often undetected or late detected in children with Williams syndrome. Visual difficulties, so many children with Williams syndrome might have squints or other issues, may need glasses, and so again this needs to be taken into account during the school. For example, children with Williams syndrome might require a specific position in the classroom so that they can hear and see the teacher better when learning. Some children with Williams syndrome have gastrointestinal problems, and this may require children with Williams syndrome to take frequent or more frequently toilet breaks. They might need the toilet more often. And many children with Williams syndrome, it's now a well-researched fact, have difficulties with sleeping, starting from infancy onwards, but actually these sleep issues remain throughout their lives. And obviously sleep is a very big factor when going through daily life and learning. So again, this needs to be taken into account in children's EHCPs. For example, children with Williams syndrome might require more frequent breaks because they're tired. So again, who could provide any evidence with regards to the health requirements of children with Williams syndrome? You could ask your pediatrician to write a report about the health issues of children with Williams syndrome, or the GP. When it comes to vision difficulties, you might want to consider a report by an ophthalmologist. Also, an ENT specialist might provide any insight or help when it comes to hearing issues. Again, the Williams Syndrome Foundation medical guidelines, as well as any reports from the physiotherapist with regards to the mobility issues of children with Williams syndrome. Let's talk about the care needs of people with Williams syndrome. And when we talk about the care needs, we should think about all the social and emotional well-being of a child with Williams syndrome. And we know from our previous research that people with Williams syndrome have physical disabilities, and some of these physical abilities may impact on their social relationships. So children with Williams syndrome find it difficult to maintain conversations. They might find it difficult due to the delayed language development, to actually play with children in a useful way, and so therefore might want to start playing by themselves. They're also less likely to run around, they're more likely to fall over, they find it more difficult to follow the rules of a game, and all of these will impact on the peer relationships that they can form during their school. Children with Williams syndrome also, as I mentioned, have some issues with independence skills due to mobility issues, but also fine motor skills or gross motor abilities. And these will impact on their independence, such as ability to use transport and how they deal with money. And again, this is about generally looking about the social well-being of people with Williams syndrome and how it affects them. There's been a number of research projects lately that have shown that many children with Williams syndrome have anxiety issues, and these anxiety issues should be addressed in the EHCP, but also it might be that for some children these anxiety issues really start to interfere with children's well-being, especially their mental health. So there might be, as they get older, higher incidences of depression, and these might actually require some intervention by CAMHS. And finally, there are a lot of sensory and behavioral issues in children with Williams syndrome. For example, the fact that they may like spinning things, or they might like to talk repeatedly about their favorite topic. And again, these should be addressed within the EHCP. So when it comes to the care needs of children with Williams syndrome, people who could provide any evidence for their needs would be family support workers, any therapists that are working with the child, but also a social worker or a youth worker, and again, an occupational therapist. And obviously for all of the sections I've just gone through, teacher reports, parent reports would also be good evidence for any of the children's needs. So far I've discussed the needs of the children of children with Williams syndrome, but now let's look about who could provide also any support. So when it comes about writing the outcomes, it should be important to mention who will be helping the child to achieve those outcomes. And so there might be the fact that Williams syndrome is a complex neurodevelopmental disorder. It's very likely that there will be some professionals or some professional therapy that is required for children with Williams syndrome. And so the first one to consider would be obviously speech and language therapy. Again, in the previous webinar, we've gone into quite a lot of detail about what should be provided. So again, I'm just going to go briefly over them. So speech and language therapists could help children with their oromotor praxis, which is the planning and the making of the sounds in order to provide oral productive speech. To help children with their semantics, which is getting children to produce more words, get their understanding of words improved. That in turn will improve children's grammar understanding and also their grammar production, which we know is important for telling stories. And in the final stages, when children are older and are using language appropriately, as I mentioned, a lot of children with Williams syndrome have difficulties with understanding language, but also with providing meaningful stories. And this mainly affects them in an educational environment when they need to recall things that have happened to them or things when they want to express their views and their needs. And this is again something that a speech and language therapist may be able to help them with, for example, using story time therapy. Secondly, physiotherapy might be required. As mentioned before, children with Williams syndrome often have weak muscle tone due to the lack of the gene elastin, and this might also cause hypermobility. So again, looking at an EHCP, this might cause difficulties with uneven surfaces, but as I mentioned before, with also writing abilities, and therefore not only could a physiotherapist help with improving these issues, but parents and teachers may also want to consider whether the child with Williams syndrome should be using a personalized laptop to help with writing during school. Further specialist help may come from an occupational therapist, thinking about a particular sensory diet, so how the children's sensory issues could be addressed. An occupational therapist might also help with some of the feeding issues, in that some children with Williams syndrome have feeding issues that are caused by their sensory difficulties with regards to certain textures. Although some children with Williams syndrome do have or show a good pincer grip, they might have difficulties with actually moving their arms and pen in an appropriate way. So again, an occupational therapist might be able to help with some tools that might help with it. Many children with Williams syndrome, as I'm sure many of you are aware, have issues with self-regulation or clothing themselves, but also with time management and self-care. So think about personal hygiene, going to the toilet, what are the different processes in going to the toilet, especially at the end, washing hands is something that an occupational therapist could help with. I mentioned this already in the previous webinar, is the fact that children with Williams syndrome often are very musical and react well to music therapy. Music therapy has been shown to be very effective in that, it contains rules, it helps children to pay attention, it improves memory, children's anxiety, language, motor development, and also it's a way for children to express themselves. So again, in the EHCP, music therapy might be considered in the outcomes in order to help children's educational needs. Other therapies that might be considered in an EHCP or specialist help that might be considered things such as drama classes to improve language, but also overall well-being and the ability for children to express themselves. Assistive technology, we already mentioned things like a personal laptop, but there might be others around that occupational therapists could advise you on. Some social group support. Again, this is where it's important to look at your local offer to see, are there any social groups that are accessible for children with special educational needs that might benefit your child. When it comes to transport, again, this is where you'll find details in your local offer about, how can the local authority help your child to go from A to B, but also what kind of courses do they provide for children with special educational needs. And obviously then there's all the visual support that might be required. So, for example, presenting one item at a time is something that teachers can easily do in a classroom, but there might be other types of visual support or visual learning that children with Williams syndrome would benefit from. This is very briefly an overview of the educational needs and health and care needs of children with Williams syndrome and how some of these could be addressed. As you may know, we've been carrying out a large study on raising awareness about the educational care and health needs in children with Williams syndrome and how these can be addressed in EHCPs. And we'll be writing more detailed guidelines about the outcomes of this research, but also guidelines in how we can support parents and professionals. And as part of this research, I want to do one final call in that we would like to get more views from professionals who have experience of working with children with Williams syndrome aged 4 to 25 years old, but also those who've got experience of working with other children with special educational needs such as Down syndrome and autism. And you can find more information on my website about how you can take part in this study. So if you're a professional who works with children with special educational needs, it's a short questionnaire that you will be asked to complete. We'll soon open the floor for any questions you may have, and I'm sure you've got many of them. We will be providing you with details of how to access the code of practice so that you could look into all the different sections that we've mentioned. And again, there will be more information about all these different sections and further reading in our guidelines. But I also want to make you aware about our final webinar that relates to this series, which will be on the 19th of January, again at 7:30. And in this final webinar, we want to give you an overview about our research and what we found in the actual research. So when it comes about, how are the needs of children with Williams syndrome actually met in the EHCPs. And I hope you'll all turn into this one as well. Okay, so let's go. If there are any questions, we'll answer them now. So we would like to thank all of you who listened tonight to our webinar and who've asked questions. I hope you found this webinar very useful. All of you who've attended will receive a copy of this webinar. We'll email it to you as soon as we can. And if you've got any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact us.